Recording. So thank you so much, Ken, for being with us today. It's really a treat to have you and to discuss your great article, Overselling Sustainability Reporting, that was published on Harvard Business Review last month. So thank you so much for being here. As I mentioned a bit earlier, this conversation is recorded. So Ken, if you could give an intro of your background, I'm sure that would be much appreciated by your listeners.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm grateful to be here, and I appreciate your kind words about the article. They have good editors at HBR. My background, I guess a convenient starting point would be after school, I spent a couple of years on Wall Street, and then I ended up spending a year at a research institute in Washington. Not sure if I wanted to get a PhD and teach or if I wanted to get involved in business. And I was there a couple of weeks and I realized I'd get involved in business and not research, because the average researchers at the think tank where I was working were 6 or 7 standard deviations from the mean smart. And I'm not that bright. And I know you don't have to be that smart to make a difference in business. So I chose that path. At business school, I became interested in manufacturing and operations. I made a trip to Japan and Korea in 1990 and visited factories at Toyota and Pusan Steel and Samsung and Sony. And at the time, Japan was what China is today in terms of a manufacturing powerhouse. And I didn't understand why the United States couldn't compete at the same level. And so I decided to shift focus from finance to factories and went to work in a factory that made instruments to create and measure vacuum for industrial processes. And at night, got a basic lathe operator's degree at a trade school. I did that for a couple of years, but I realized to advance there, you had to be an engineer, and I'm not an engineer. So I ended up at Timberland in 1992 because Timberland at the time made all of its own footwear in its own factories, mostly in the United States. 3 of the 4 factories were US and 1 was Dominican Republic. And I was committed to making things in this country. So I spent the beginning of my time at Timberland in Puerto Rico, running a factory there of 1,000 people. And over time, because the company grew, I got the chance to do things that I didn't deserve to do on paper, and ultimately became the chief operating officer, served as the chief operating officer from 2000 to 2007. And when I left, the company was 10 times bigger than when I started, which was just great fortune. My timing was excellent, and I got to work for a company that I believed in and was aligned with in terms of values. I became CEO of a privately traded owned company in Switzerland for an interim gig for 1.5 years, which had a great outcome. And since then, I've been working across a range of portfolio of activities, all focused at the intersection of capitalism and natural capital, as an advisor, as an investor, as a teacher, as a writer, as a board member. And that's how I spend time today.
Oh, that's a wonderful journey and an exciting portfolio of activities you're spending your time on. And I think that's really what, at least as I read the article, that was very obvious to me, that you had a strong life experience to back it up and not just research.
Well, I think the reason that they published the piece is because I do straddle kind of the operating world and the investment world and the academic world. And so I think I have the ability to relate to practical challenges as well as theory. But I'm grateful they did.
Yes, and I'm looking forward. You were mentioning that you have a couple of pieces that will follow, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of them as well. So one of the things I would love you to do, if you are okay with that, is could you give us maybe your definition of sustainability reporting, because that's really what we're going to discuss. And also, what were the goals when sustainability reporting, when put in place 20 years ago?
So another word that people use for sustainability reporting is non-financial reporting, which I don't love. Another one is pre-financial reporting, which I don't love either. So I guess I don't have a great solution for what the field should be called. But, sustainability reporting tries to capture non-financial or pre-financial information that would be useful, including, environmental, social, and governance measures. It's become complicated. The first framework to create standards for sustainability reporting was an outgrowth of an NGO in Boston called Ceres and the Trillium Group. It was called GRI, or it is called GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. Mm-hmm. And now over 5,000 companies use their format to report, but it's very, very cumbersome, very detailed, very time-consuming, and it comes in lots of different units of measure, from liters to metric tons to grams to dollars to head count to accidents. And it's hard for investors, I think, and certainly very, very remote from consumers, to make sense of the reports. Since GRI was founded, there's been a number of competing acronyms that are also used as standards for sustainability reporting, including IIRC, which is the International Integrated Reporting Council, and then SASB, which is the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and many others as well. And so it becomes a bit of an acronym soup and confusing to investors and companies how to report. Worse yet, the reports aren't audited typically, and they're not standardized, and they're not mandated. And so companies can choose to leave out certain metrics. They can choose to measure certain outcomes based on what data they have or how they choose to measure things. And investors love comparability and they love assurance. And to date, when it comes to sustainability reporting, both of those things are still lacking.
And so if I guess we put ourselves back 20 years ago, the goals were to improve, equality, sustainability. But you were mentioning in your article that actually what happened in reality in the last 20 years was that there was a rise of carbon emissions that was increased as well in environmental damages and social inequalities. So that's probably the basis for your analysis that the sustainability reporting has not worked as well as we thought it would be 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think I didn't answer your second part of your question with what were the goals back then. And I think that's really idiosyncratic depending on the company. I think some companies, the one I work for, Timberland, is genuine about trying to provide investors and consumers really with a clear sense of what the company's impacts were, both positive and negative. In fact, we invited critique of our ESG, or at the time, so CSR reports. We invited people who didn't think we were doing a good enough job to literally write in the report itself what we could do a better job of each time we reported. And even after I left, Timberland was reporting quarterly on their CSR performance, just like they were reporting on their financial performance. Yeah. There were other companies that I think used it more as a marketing document, and it was actually produced by their Marcoms teams. And so I think it depends on the company, what the goals were for CSR reporting. You're mentioning that, we're now 20, 25 years later, and, over that period of time, carbon emissions have doubled, and inequality is certainly gapped in the United States. And so I think it's fair to ask, what has all this reporting gotten us? Mm-hmm. And it's not clear to me that disclosure should be equated with progress. Just because we, provide information doesn't mean we're doing much about it. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yes, and I think we see a lot of that with organizations, at least in the developed world. I see that in the gender diversity arena, which is something I've been quite involved and quite passionate about, where you can hear and read a lot of nice thoughts, but in reality doesn't really transcribe into fact. So I think that's the same thing. Would you like to maybe give us some examples of these failures of sustainability reporting through the lenses of companies like Timberland, which you've seen firsthand, but also Patagonia or Aspen Skiing Company? I thought it was very insightful to understand a real life example.
Sure. Well, you mentioned gender data. I'm equally passionate about that, and I'm actually encouraged by how that's risen on the agenda of a lot of companies over the last year, certainly. But gender data is actually cleaner than carbon data, for example. And some complexity around it, but for the most part, it's easier to make a gender determination than it is one's carbon footprint. And so when you ask about challenges or failures, I think carbon is a good place to focus. I view climate change as an existential threat, and yet I mentioned how carbon emissions continue to rise. And when you look at reporting, you don't get a clear sense of really what's happening, unfortunately. And what I mean more specifically is, carbon emissions are governed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is, a NGO-inspired group that helps people measure exactly what their emissions are. And emissions are broken into 3 different scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. And this gets nerdy and technical. But, scope 1 emissions are the ones that you create yourself through company-owned vehicles and the like. Scope 2 are for purchased electricity. And scope 3 is everything else. There's 15 categories of scope 3 emissions that range from upstream to downstream. So they could be emissions from Timberland's first-tier suppliers, or Timberland's leather tanneries, or the deforestation that occurred to allow a rancher to have his cattle graze. Those are all, scope 3 emissions. So too are the emissions that come from use of a product and disposal. Okay. And unfortunately, there's no easy way to track scope 3 emissions. And so because it's not mandated, today, more often than not, companies don't provide scope 3 emissions data. And if you think that's a small technicality, in Timberland's case, that amounted to 96% of our emissions profile were in scope 3. Yeah. And so whereas we reported on our scope 1 and 2 emissions and our progress annually against them, we weren't able to report on scope 3. And that's 96% of total. And so it's not clear to me how we as a society make progress if we're not reporting on the bulk of our emissions.
Yes, and that's very interesting, because to your point, small technicality that ends up being 96% of the emission, it's more than a foot line, so it's important to realize that it's not just a small part that is not taken into consideration. You mentioned obviously the challenge, to your point, in assessing this type of data. You were also mentioning in your article additional challenges like the lack of auditing, the opaque supply chains, which I think touch very much to this scope number 3, the complexity to actually report on that. Would you like to touch maybe on a few of these problems, and at least probably the ones you think were the most important?
Well, I mentioned the problem before about the absence of harmonization of different reporting standards. The good news there is that the IFRS has now convened a group and is working with the standard setters to try to reach a common set of metrics. That would be a great step. An additional great step would be if they were made to be mandatory either by the SEC or stock exchanges. And a final great step would be if they were then audited. It wasn't until the SEC was created in the shadow of the Great Depression that we got to standardization of financial reporting and audit as well. And I think we will and need to get to the same place for sustainability reporting.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. If you don't have these additional steps, you're missing the feedback loop. So you're missing the point. If we change a bit I would say our hat, which is a pendant to sustainability reporting, and we look at sustainable investing. You also mentioned a few challenges with sustainable investing, like ratings that are unreliable, which makes sense if you think the reporting is itself flawed from the get-go. The lack of comparability, the fact that the definition of sustainability is not the same from the get-go either. Any thoughts you would like to expand on this really sustainable investing piece?
Sure. What companies have called typically sustainability or corporate responsibility or corporate social responsibility, the investment world calls ESG, which is environmental, standard, social, and governance. It's typically the same thing, two sides of the same coin. And the good news is ESG has become in vogue in the last 5 years, really in the last 2 years. And depending on what data source you look at, you could say that ESG investing now represents $1 in every $3 invested globally, over $30 trillion, which is saying a lot because that number was less than $1 trillion 10 years ago. And so there's massive growth in the space and massive inflows and funds created and all really good stuff. The challenge is, like with CSR reporting, ESG investing is also reasonably unregulated. There's an article in the Financial Times today that called ESG marketing for banks a marketer's dream because there's so little precision required. So most asset managers can call whatever they'd like ESG. I'll give you a concrete example, which is one that I just learned about. On April 8th in the United States, so just about a month ago, BlackRock launched the largest ETF ever raised in a single day. They raised $1.25 billion for an ETF that was called the U.S. Carbon Readiness Transition Fund, which is clearly an ESG fund focused on, climate. Yeah. And which is exciting. They also raised $250 million that same day in a global climate or carbon transition readiness fund. When you look at the top 5 or top 3 holdings in that fund, you'll see they are companies like Alphabet and Facebook and JP Morgan Chase, none of which really have much to do with carbon readiness or carbon transition. In fact, JP Morgan Chase is the largest financier of fossil fuels in the world.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's not clear to me that, first of all, ESG funds outperform the market, notwithstanding what some of the academic studies have said. We can't confuse correlation with causation. And it's certainly not clear to me that ESG investing leads to improved social and environmental outcomes. And so I worry that the good news here is inflated.
So yes, and I really enjoy your last point. We discussed that a bit offline. So the fact that you doubt that the ESG investing impacts outcomes. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that, or do you want to keep that for another conversation?
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, there's been a great deal of study, over thousands of studies, literally, in the last 10 years that look at whether ESG investing leads to better equity returns. And if you go back in time, even 10 years ago, the prevailing wisdom on Wall Street was that investing in ESG or companies that invested in CSR would underperform the market. That was definitely the prevailing wisdom when I was at Timberland. We didn't get a lot of positive feedback from the analyst community on our ESG investments. Yeah. And that's changed now, which is good. Over the last 10 years, all this academic and institutional work has shown that, at least you're not giving up return. And more than 2/3 of the studies say you can actually generate alpha as a result of ESG investing. We can have a separate conversation about whether that's valid or not, but that's what the studies are saying. But there's been almost no study of does ESG investing change environmental and social outcomes. And I think that a lot of investors care about that. I think they're investing in ESG funds not just for the excess return, but because they think they're doing something to help advance social equity or environmental stewardship. And I don't think they are. And so if we create this false hope, does it let governments off the hook to regulate, and does it let companies off the hook to advance these outcomes? And I worry that it does.
Mm. Well, that's I would say a scary thought to look at that. I do believe, like you, that investors who allocate capital to ESG or impact funds don't do that for the returns. I think they would at least to have the same or a maybe slight discount, but I don't think they're doing that for excess return. But if you don't see value over a certain period of times, that defeat the purpose, I think, for most investors. One of the question I have for you, you mentioned at the end of your article some areas to focus instead of focusing so much on the reporting, and it's always interesting, the fact of the focus being reporting versus what we were trying to achieve. I always look at it as religion, when you forget that the point is to actually, I would say maybe be a better person, and you focus just on the process. and that's what reporting makes me think of, like where you're actually just going through the motion and you totally miss why you're doing it. So you were mentioning a few ideas, or at least a few thoughts, measuring less, changing the system. What for you is the most, if we think that, okay, the reporting doesn't work very well and the sustainability investing is not either changing the world, so what should we do?
Well, I believe in systems thinking. I'm a big acolyte of Danella Meadows and her work, and I think that if the rules and incentives of the system stay the same, you're going to get the same behavior. Mm-hmm. And more reporting and more disclosure will be helpful, but very, very marginally. I think we have good data that demonstrates that. Think, for example, of in the United States a number of years ago, there was a labeling requirement put on for restaurant chains above a certain size, where they had to put calorie data on their food products. At Starbucks, for example, a brand muffin's 450 calories versus a sandwich's whatever. Well, I don't think that's had much impact on obesity rates in this country. Mm-hmm. If anything, people are fatter today than they were, 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so disclosure alone, from my standpoint, can be helpful, but it's really on the margins. And so I think if we want different outcomes, we need to change the system rules and incentives. And that's hard, but it's a higher leverage place to focus.
Yes, and it's interesting. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a lady who focuses on systemic changes, and the idea of ESG investing, not just to solve the symptoms, but how do you change the causes, really. Again, I'm from the school, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a middle ground type of person, so I think we need to work on both the symptoms and the causes at the same time. Just working on the symptoms, I agree with you, like obviously you're never going to have any progress. If you just work on the root cause, usually it takes so much time, and you still need your quick wins and show progress and success. So I think it's a balance between both, but I hear you. I think very often it looks more like slightly correcting something versus rethinking what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
I have one last question for you, and again, I'm using a bit what we discussed before we officially started the conversation. You were mentioning a work you were doing, or at least a work that was being done, which with Harvard, in terms of dollarizing. I like that word. I didn't know it. Dollarizing externalities. Would you like to say a bit on that? I think it's a very, very interesting approach.
Yeah, there's a project at Harvard now that's called the Impact Weighted Accounts Project. It's funded by a Brit named Sir Ronald Cohen, who's the founder of Apax, which is one of the largest private equity firms in Europe, or not Europe, I guess it's the UK. And he's a wonderful guy. He's also founder of Social Finance. He's the founder of Bridges. I think he's genuinely committed to having investment be a source of push for the system towards good. And he's tasked George Seraphim, who's a professor there, and a cadre of PhDs with coming up with a methodology for dollarizing all externalities for public companies. So that you can say, you know, for JetBlue versus American Airlines, you know, how much do they pollute? How much basic travel do they support? How much luxury travel? What's the benefits they create in terms of job creation and taxation? What are the negatives they create in terms of pollution or greenhouse gas emissions? And then applying dollar values to all those positives and negatives, netting them out and coming to a dollarized version of the value that the company delivers, not just economic value, but value dimensionalized as economic, human, social, environmental, and product impact. And it's complex, and its span is broad to include all publicly traded companies. And it's interesting. I worry that there's a lot of practical challenges and that subjective value assumptions that need to be applied in order to get this to work. So I'm not sure that it's going to be effective, but it's an interesting approach. Yeah,
it is. And you know what, when we discussed a bit earlier, I didn't understand it was at the company level. It does make sense. I was thinking at a product level, which I guess is even more complicated, probably. I do think that, you know, that wouldn't hurt to have some, I don't know, 15, 20, 25 products that people use, I would say mindlessly. And when I say people, I include myself in people. I'm not pointing finger. And just realizing what is really the cost, the real cost, not the price. And is the value we're getting is aligned with the cost and the price. I think it's probably not what they're looking at, but that could be a good way for everyone, not just investors, to really understand what it means. I think we need to bring it down for the general public. And I'm not sure what your thoughts on that, but as you were talking, I realized that I misunderstood the fact that it was at the company level.
Yeah, they're doing it at the product and the company level. The product level to roll up to the company level.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So they're doing both. I'm not convinced that they have the ability to price externalities, B, that they have the ability to make subjective value judgments about the efficacy of products. So for example, let's say you're a lithium mining company. Well, you get a lot of negative scores and negative dollar hits for environmental destruction. You probably get a lot of negatives also for social impact if you're employing child labor in the DRC. But if that's all you're looking at, you're ignoring the positives associated with lithium that may allow us to get off internal combustion engine vehicles and switch over to electric vehicles and lower our global impact that way. And so where you draw the boundaries and how you make value judgments and how you assign externalities, dollar values, those are all, I think, really, really thorny, tricky ethical questions.
Yes, and to your point earlier, that makes things complicated when you don't have hard and fast rules, and that everyone can more or less use his own judgment, even if it's coming from a good place. We're all coming with our own bias, you know. So one thing might be more important for me than for you, and then you end up with very different results. That's very interesting. Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time. I realize we're already out of time. Do you have any parting thoughts that you want to share with our listeners on that topic?
I would just distinguish between, we talk a lot about investors and companies and regulators and consumers. I think we have to act more as citizens, not consumers. And as citizens, I think we have a responsibility to change the governance that we have to help redefine the rules of the system. I think, we get the governance, unfortunately, we deserve, so we have to raise our voice as citizens to demand more.
I love that, Ken. I couldn't echo that more, we tend to think we're powerless. Actually, we have way more power than we think we have. And there is the citizen aspect for the governance, which is linked very much with what you were mentioning, the system change. I still also like this concept of responsible consumer in also trying to make sure when you consume something that you understand what it means behind. And I think both are actually complementary. So thank you so much. These were very great parting thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
No, that was wonderful, Ken, and I'm really looking forward to reading your next two pieces in HBR.
Well, I hope they're interested in printing them. We'll see.
I'm sure they will. Thank you so much, Ken. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.